So to start, what is theory? Often when I talk about theory, I ask a group or a class the question and people struggle with it. And here I'm just presenting a very simple concept, which is how things relate to each other. And by things, I'm meaning behaviours, thoughts, emotions, environmental and social variables. And theory in relation to interventions, one can think about how do interventions work? What are their mechanisms of action, which we may call mediators, but also importantly, why do interventions vary? So theories can explain both how interventions work, but why they vary across populations, settings, types of target. And these are often referred to as moderators or modifying variables. So some people are skeptical about the use of theory. So we need to think about, well, why should we use theory? What's the advantage of drawing on theory when we're designing interventions? One is to build knowledge. Theory can summarize the current state of knowledge. It can structure our thinking and guide our research. And it provides a framework in which we can accumulate evidence. So we don't have lots of different bits and pieces of empirical findings in different populations and settings and behaviours, and we don't know how they relate to each other. It can provide a framework to bring that evidence together. And it can also help communication across research groups. So that's something about its role in building knowledge. It can also help in designing and evaluating interventions. So it can identify both barriers and facilitators to change, identify what it is exactly that needs to change. As I said before, it can identify mechanisms of action to help us understand processes of change and the modifying influences, so we can understand the range of applications that any intervention is likely to be effective in. And then it can help inform research. So it can begin to explicitly conceptualize the causal processes by which interventions are expected to have effects on outcome. And we've heard some of that this morning. And theory ought to guide the evaluation questions, measurement and design, analysis and interpretation. So theory should be a framework that links every stage of the research process. So thinking about how to apply theory to change behaviour, one can apply formal theories, and we've heard about some formal theories in relation to identity earlier this morning. And in terms of behaviour change, I'm going to present a result of a review which identified 80 theories, and I'm also going to present a way of assessing the extent to which interventions can be said to be based on theory. Or one can use more integrative theoretical frameworks. And later today, I'll talk more about a couple of these. So if we wish to use a formal theory to develop a particular intervention, the question is, well, what formal theories should we draw on? Often interventions are not explicitly based on theory, and the range of theories that interventions do draw on is quite limited. So to give an example of this, a review of 190 studies of intervention to increase physical activity and healthy eating that myself, Andy Presswick and others did, found that only 56% of these use theory, which means almost half of these interventions are not using theory in any shape or form. And we also found that just 2 theories absolutely dominated this field. So social cognitive theory was used in 59 of the interventions, and the trans-theoretical model in 58. And especially with the latter, there are question marks over the extent to which that is the most productive theory to use. And all the other theories put together only accounted for 45 over those 107 theories. So the issue that we addressed in the review we did was, are there potentially useful theories that are underused? So what we did was bring a group, it's a multidisciplinary group of experts together, covering psychology, sociology, anthropology, and economics, to develop a search strategy and oversee the literature search. And it's very important, I think most of you, if not all of you, work in interdisciplinary concepts. But no one discipline ever has all the answers, so very important to work in a cross-disciplinary way. And in this review, published in Health Psychology Review, we identified 83 theories. And there were so many, and we wanted to do so much, that what started as an article ended up as a book, where we include the summary of the original descriptions of these theories. We also extracted the constructs from these theories. So the total number in these 83 theories were 1,738. With a mean of 19, the least was 5 constructs, and one theory had 84 constructs within them. We also looked at network diagrams of the source theories. So which other theories were explicitly drawn on in developing each theory. And then in the future, we're planning to develop a searchable website, so people could say, I'm interested in a theory that has one or more of the following constructs, and then be able to identify these theories. However, what we thought would be a very simple procedure to do this turned out to be very complicated, because of these 1,738 constructs, many of them are essentially the same thing but with different labels. And so we need to be able to identify the extent to which these are actually the same or different and what their relationships are with each other. Now, I'm not going to read all of these theories, but here are the first 42 of them, and I'm sure you can recognize a few up there. And here is the rest of them. So just to give you an example of the lists of constructs, here's a pretty brief one, social cognitive theory, and this was the constructs just from the very earliest published description of the theory. So you can see these are different kinds of constructs at different levels of generality. And then to give you an example of our network analyses, we're going to hear about health action process approach later. These are showing the range of theories that the HAPA author, Ralph Schwarzer, had cited in terms of influencing his theory. Because another thing to really remember about theory and all of our science is it's cumulative. We're always building on what's gone before. And the more we can be explicit about that process, the more we can learn from each other, the more efficient we'll be, and the more productive. But there's very little work really looking at how theories have evolved from each other. When does one theory become a completely new theory, etc.? And in this review, these issues became very salient. Now, in looking at these 83 theories, a few things became quite evident. So the first was that theories were often very poorly described. When we were trying to extract the constructs and write a description of what this theory was, we really came up against the fact that often what were in the diagrams was different than what was in the texts, and there were bits that were missing or bits that were quite confusing. So that was one issue. I think we can do a lot better in describing our theories. Most are partial accounts. So of those 83, 3 were only 3 of these identified to be integrative or setting out to be integrative. And the other thing was a lot of overlap between the theories. And one of the things I should have said is, with this review, we were very strict in terms of our inclusion criteria. So there had to be an outcome of behaviour. And we also were quite strict about what we define by theory. So these 83 are just a small set of the theories that are relevant to the broader issues of behaviour. When we looked at the constructs, again, they were poorly described. As I said, many appeared the same or similar. And the issue about the labels that are used for constructs and then the definition is another interesting one. And often these two things didn't seem to go together terribly well. And the relationships between the constructs were often not described or poorly described. Often people would put an arrow and think, well the arrow's that's the relationship, but what does that arrow actually signify? One of the other things that we set out to do in the review, and with this multidisciplinary group, was to think about the issue about what is a good theory, because we set out by thinking some of the theories we're working with are too individualistic, they're accused of being narrow and deterministic. Are there other theories out there that we could use in our research? But we also wanted to think about, well, how can we evaluate the usefulness of theories in guiding our research, in developing and evaluating interventions? Which meant we had to come up with criteria. What do we mean by a good theory? And the group identified 9 criteria. So these are them. How clear the constructs are, how clear the relationships are, the extent to which any of this is measurable and testable, how explanatory the theory is, the extent to which the theory is able to describe causality, how parsimonious the theory is, and how generalizable across different situations. This is in terms of general use. And ninthly, having an evidence base. And in our naivety, or in my naivety, I thought we'll do this review, we'll find all these theories, we'll evaluate them using these criteria, and then we'll know which ones to work with. But if you stop and think about it, how do we operationalize these criteria? How do we actually use these to evaluate theories? So everything's work in progress, but this is only very partially along the way of progress. Another question is how well is theory applied? Even though only half the theories half the studies that we found in the review with Andy Prestwich mention theory, many of them said this intervention is theory-based, and in the introduction it cited some theories, or a theory, that the intervention was based on. Then you heard nothing more about that theory until in the discussion it said, and so these results show partial support for this theory. Now, this isn't a way of being able to build our science or build knowledge, and we do need to be able to identify the extent to which theory is used and be more explicit in our work about how are we using these constructs and these relationships to do any of the things that I mentioned before in terms of designing and evaluating interventions and the broader research process. And a question sometimes asked, are interventions based on theory more effective than those that aren't? And people say different things. And when you look at the literature, it's a very mixed picture. My answer to that question is we don't know. And we can't know because interventions aren't sufficiently explicit about how they've based their work on the theory. And so if somebody says something's theory-based, is that enough to say it's theory-based? Or do we demand a bit more? So one of the things I did was develop what I've called the theory coding scheme, which is a reliable scale of 19 items, so that people can use this to evaluate theory-based interventions to identify the extent to which they are based on theory. The 19 items cover things such as whether theory is mentioned, how theory is directly used in designing the intervention, how it might be indirectly used, for example, in terms of guiding tailoring or participant selection, how it can explain intervention effects, and then how theory informs future theory development. Of the 56% of the studies I mentioned that explicitly reported theory, it was used partially and consistently. So, here's an example. One would expect that the intervention would target certain theoretical constructs that would then change behaviour. But when we looked at this, in 90% of studies, the behaviour change techniques that were mentioned were not linked to any theoretical constructs. And 91% of the studies, there were constructs mentioned in the report, in the paper, that weren't targeted by behaviour change techniques. So you had some behaviour change techniques and you had some theoretical constructs, but the links between them weren't identified. So one of the things we need to do is be more explicit about the way we use theory, but also about how we report theory. So in this book that ABC Behaviour Change Theories, we have this template that Robert led the work of, which is identifying the key summary, the key dimensions, which we should be thinking about when we're reporting theory in relation to intervention development. So because of time, I won't go through all the dimensions, but you can read them all up there. Okay, so I want to just finish now by talking about the future work that I'm involved in and developing. And this is to build what I'm calling a behaviour change ontology. What do I mean by ontology? This is a structure that systematically represents and organises the essential elements of behaviour change interventions. So it codifies our collective knowledge, reflects a consensus on the concepts and terms and relationships, because people use these in very different ways. And if we're not using the same language, it's very difficult to be scientific and to be efficient and productive in our work. And it specifies and formalizes these concepts and terms and relationships. And one of the things that I'm doing is beginning to collaborate with computer science to help with this process. Now, what does an ontology of behaviour change interventions look like? Here is a simple representation of it. So we have an intervention that is aimed at a target behaviour and has various mechanisms by which its effects are realised. The intervention may or may not be used in practice, so the extent to which it's used in practice is very important to be able to represent. We talked earlier about context, absolutely key, that the extent to which the intervention plays out in terms of mechanisms and the mechanisms in terms of target behaviour will depend on context. And what do I mean by context? Here this is unpacked to some extent. So the intervention itself is both the content, the active ingredients that bring about the change, the behaviour change techniques. I'll talk about that a bit later today, but also the delivery, the mode of delivery, whether it's face-to-face, digital, etc., and then things like response, dose response, etc. Then the context, here you can see another triangle. We have the setting in which the intervention is, the target population, and also other behaviours that will influence the extent to which any of this works. So one of the ways in which I'm developing this is in order to have this as a standard way in which we can extract evidence from our publications in order to put evidence together across many heterogeneous kinds of behaviours, settings, populations, etc. And the current work I'm doing is just looking at the relationships between the content, the behaviour change techniques, and mechanisms of action, the theoretical constructs. Because if we're to develop theory-based interventions and evaluate them in such a way that we can learn about theory, and also if we're to use theory to understand which behaviour change techniques have which effects, then we need to know what are the mechanisms of action of all these different behaviour change techniques. And at the moment, different people will say different things. So I have a grant where we're working with a large international advisory board to do some consensus work to produce what will be a very large matrix of the mechanisms of action associated with behaviour change techniques, so that we can begin to get the most out of developing and evaluating theory-based interventions. So next step is to develop this ontology, establish an integrated human-computer expert. I think there's 2,000 new publications a week to do with behaviour change interventions. So we need to be able to do this automatically and update to be really useful. And the long-term vision is to create an open access, systematized clearinghouse of continually updated evidence-based intervention components. And we can use that to be able to understand interventions and be able to select components for one's particular purpose. And finally, acknowledgements of key collaborators in this work. Thanks.